Can ancient stone walls absorb the trauma of a nation recovering from war? In the shadow of the Blitz, the Tower of London stood as a monument to endurance. But inside, something was breaking. The 1954 Yeoman Warder exorcism is often dismissed as a myth, a mere ghost story for tourists. But internal documents from the Ministry of Defense tell a different story, a story of a literal breaking point for the men who stood guard. Yeoman Warder George Abbott reported a visceral, oppressive presence in the Salt Tower, a feeling that paralyzed veterans of the front lines. It led to the first officially sanctioned exorcism at the tower since the Reformation, a spiritual cleansing born of necessity. Join us as we expose the hidden psychological reality behind London's most famous supernatural event, where trauma met the stone tape of history. Welcome to the Conjuring Files. Today we are unlocking a file that has been kept in the shadows of the Tower of London for over 7 decades. This is not a ghost story for children. This is a forensic examination of a moment when the boundary between the physical world and the spiritual realm seemed to shatter. Within the most fortified building in Britain, we're going back to 1954, a time when the scars of World War II were still fresh. And the men who guarded the crown jewels were not just soldiers, but survivors of a global catastrophe. What happened in the Salt Tower that night was not merely a sighting, it was an intervention. A ritual, a desperate attempt to cleanse a fortress that had become saturated with fear. If you are ready to step into the cold, damp darkness of history, make sure to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. We are about to walk the same cobblestones that terrified the bravest men in England. Let's open the file together. The year is 1954. London is rebuilding, but the soul of the city is still bruised. Inside the Tower of London, the air is thick with the weight of centuries. It is a place where heads have rolled, where prisoners have starved, and where the echoes of agony seem to be trapped in the mortar. On a cold, fog-laden night in November, Yeoman Warder George Abbott begins his routine patrol. Abbott is not a superstitious man. He is a veteran, a man of discipline, trained to face danger without flinching. But as he approaches the Salt Tower, the atmosphere shifts. The temperature drops sharply, a sudden biting chill that penetrates his uniform. The fog outside seems to press against the windows, blocking out the moonlight, leaving him in a suffocating darkness. Abbott reports feeling a presence. Not a shadow, not a trick of the light, but a tangible, malevolent weight pressing against his chest. He describes it as a paralysis, a freezing of the limbs that defies medical explanation. He tries to move, to call out, but his voice is stolen by the silence. In the corner of his eye, he sees a figure. It is indistinct, a swirling mass of gray mist that coalesces into the shape of a woman. The Gray Lady. She does not speak, she screams. A silent, psychic scream that reverberates in Abbott's mind, shattering his composure. He collapses, not from fatigue, but from pure, unadulterated terror. When he is found hours later, he is shivering violently, his eyes wide with a horror that his colleagues have never seen before. The immediate fallout is chaotic. The tower is a closed community, a village within a city. News travels fast. Whispers spread through the quarters like wildfire. The other yeoman warders, many of whom are also veterans, begin to report strange occurrences. Doors slamming shut on their own. The sound of footsteps in empty corridors. A feeling of being watched from the shadows. The panic is not just individual, it is collective. The institutional stability of the tower is threatened. These are the guardians of the monarchy, the symbols of order and strength. If they are crumbling, what to say about the state of the nation? The leadership within the tower faces a crisis. This is not a simple case of a scared guard. This is a systemic breakdown. The men are refusing to patrol certain areas. Sleep is impossible. The anxiety is palpable, hanging in the air like smoke. The standard protocols for dealing with intruders or disturbances are useless here. You cannot arrest a feeling. You cannot shoot a memory. Realizes that traditional security measures are failing. The fear is infecting the very foundation of the institution. Why did this specific haunting require such drastic action? Because it was not just about ghosts, it was about control. The tower represents authority. If the authority figures are paralyzed by fear, the symbol is broken. The decision is made to bring in outside help, not the police, not the doctors, but the church. The need for a formal intervention becomes clear. This is no longer a matter of folklore, it is a matter of survival. The men are breaking down, the walls are closing in, and in the center of it all stands the Salt Tower, a silent witness to the unraveling of sanity. The stage is set for a confrontation that would blur the lines between faith, psychology, and the unknown. The panic within the walls was real, and it demanded a response that would echo through history. Stay with us, because the solution they chose was more terrifying than the problem. The decision to perform an exorcism in the Tower of London was not taken lightly. In fact, it was shrouded in secrecy. Since the Reformation, the Church of England had moved away from the dramatic rites of expulsion seen in Catholic tradition. Exorcisms were rare, skeptical, and heavily regulated. But the situation in 1954 was deemed exceptional. The lieutenant of the tower, along with senior clergy, convened in secret. They reviewed the reports, they spoke with Abbot. They felt the weight of the atmosphere themselves. The conclusion was undeniable. The tower needed cleansing. Enter Reverend John Pearce-Higgins, a canon of St. Paul's Cathedral and a man known for his openness to the paranormal. Pearce-Higgins was chosen to lead the rite. This was not a Hollywood spectacle. There were no spinning heads, no projectile vomiting, no dramatic levitations. It was a quiet, solemn, and intensely psychological battle. The atmosphere of the 1954 rite was one of profound tension. The participants entered the Salt Tower at night, carrying only their prayer books and their faith. The air was heavy, oppressive. The silence was deafening. Oh yes, it was. Pearce-Higgins began the service. The words of the liturgy echoed off the cold stone walls, sounding thin and fragile against the weight of the history surrounding them. As he prayed, the reactions of the Yeoman Warders present were visceral. Some reported feeling a sudden release of pressure, as if a vice had been loosened from their chests. Others described a wave of nausea, a physical rejection of the sacred words. The ritual was not just spiritual, it was somatic. It affected the body. The reverence of the moment was punctuated by moments of sheer terror. Shadows seemed to lengthen across the floor. The flickering candlelight cast distorted shapes that danced on the walls. Mimicking the movements of the unseen, the official narrative shifted carefully in the aftermath. The tower's administration was caught between medieval tradition and modern skepticism. They could not admit to a full-blown demonic possession, as it would undermine the rational image of the institution. Nor could they dismiss the events entirely, as the testimony of credible men like Abbot was undeniable. So, they crafted a narrative of blessing and cleansing. The term exorcism was whispered, not shouted. Reports were filed, but they were vague, focusing on the spiritual well-being of the staff rather than the expulsion of a specific entity. This balancing act reveals the deep conflict within the post-war establishment. They wanted to believe in science, in progress, in the modern world. But when faced with the inexplicable, they reached back into the ancient tools of the past. The ritual was a bridge between two worlds. It acknowledged the reality of the fear while attempting to contain it within the framework of religious tradition. Pearce-Higgins later wrote about the experience, describing a palpable sense of evil that lifted after the prayers were concluded. He did not claim to have seen a demon, but he claimed to have felt a presence withdraw. The secrecy surrounding the event adds to its allure. Why hide it? Because admitting that the Tower of London, the seat of power, was vulnerable to supernatural forces was politically and socially dangerous. It suggested that the rational order of the 20th century was fragile, that beneath the surface of modernity, the old fears still lived. The ritual under wraps was not just about banishing a ghost, it was about restoring order. It was about giving the men a way to process their terror through a structured, authoritative act. And as we will see, the effectiveness of this ritual may have had less to do with demons and more to do with the human need for resolution. The rite was completed, the candles were extinguished. But was the darkness truly gone? Or had it simply retreated into the stones? To understand the 1954 incident, we must look beyond the Salt Tower. We must look at the world outside. London in 1954 was a city still healing from the Blitz. The bombs had stopped falling 9 years prior. But the psychological scars remained deep. The Tower of London itself had been a target. It had survived, but it bore the marks of the conflict. The men who served as Yeoman Warders were not random recruits. They were decorated veterans, men who had seen combat, who had lost friends, who had witnessed the horrors of war firsthand. Connect the 1954 supernatural outbreak to the lingering psychological scars of the Blitz. These men carried the weight of their experiences with them into the tower. The isolation of living within the ancient stone walls acted as a pressure cooker for communal anxiety. There was no escape. The tower was their home, their workplace, and their prison. The boundaries between past and present blurred. When Abbott saw the Grey Lady, was he seeing a ghost from the 16th century, or was he projecting the trauma of the 20th? The Grey Lady is a recurring figure in tower folklore, often associated with Anne Boleyn. But in the context of 1954, she may have represented something else. She may have been the embodiment of loss, of grief, of the silent suffering that these men had endured. Explore how the Beefeaters, many being decorated veterans, may have projected their collective shell shock onto the legend. Shell shock, now known as PTSD, manifests in various ways: hypervigilance, nightmares, hallucinations, the feeling of being watched, the sudden onset of paralysis. These are all symptoms of severe trauma. In a high-stress environment like the tower, where the history is so violent, these symptoms can easily be interpreted as supernatural. The mind seeks a cause for the pain. And what better cause than a ghost? It externalizes the internal turmoil. It gives the fear a shape that can be fought, or at least acknowledged. Examine the isolation of living within stone walls. The tower is cut off from the modern world. It is a bubble of history. The sounds of the city are muted. The light is different. The air is stale. This sensory deprivation can lead to shared sensory distortions. When one person reports a sight or a sound, others are primed to see it too. The collective trauma of the working class, and in this case the military class, manifested as a supernatural entity. The Grey Lady was not just a ghost, she was a symbol of the vulnerability of these strong men. She was the part of them that was afraid, the part that had been broken by war, coming out to play in the dark. The post-war hysteria was not unique to the tower. It was a national phenomenon. People were seeking meaning in the chaos. They were looking for signs. The supernatural provided a narrative that made sense of the nonsense of war. If there were ghosts, then there was an afterlife. If there were demons, then there was a battle between good and evil. It provided a structure to a world that felt random and cruel. The 1954 incident was a microcosm of this larger societal trend. It was a moment where the personal trauma of a few men intersected with the collective anxiety of a nation. And in that intersection, a monster was born, or perhaps a monster was revealed. The stones of the tower had absorbed the blood of thousands. Was it so hard to believe they had also absorbed the fear?
It is the story. Anyone?
Investigate the contagion effect. Fear is infectious. When a credible authority figure like George Abbott expresses terror, it validates the suppressed fears of his colleagues. It gives them permission to be afraid. This creates a feedback loop. One man sees a shadow, another hears a footstep, a third feels a chill. Soon, everyone is seeing, hearing, and feeling. The individual experiences merge into a collective reality. This is mass sociogenic illness, also known as mass hysteria. It is a well-documented psychological phenomenon, particularly in closed, high-stress communities. Break down the architectural factors. The Salt Tower is an old structure. It has thick walls, narrow windows, and poor ventilation. Scientists today know that such environments can generate infrasound, low-frequency sound waves. Waves that are below the threshold of human hearing but can cause feelings of unease, anxiety, and even visual hallucinations. Fluctuating magnetic fields caused by electrical wiring or geological features can also affect the brain's temporal lobe, leading to sensations of presence or dread. The tower is a perfect storm of these environmental triggers. It is a place where the physics of the building conspires against the psychology of the inhabitants. Contrast the 1950s spiritual explanation with modern psychological understandings. In the 1950s, the language of distress was spiritual. If you felt evil, it was because there was evil. Today we have the language of neuroscience and psychology. We talk about cortisol levels, sleep deprivation, and cognitive bias. But does knowing the mechanism make the experience less real? For the men in the tower, the fear was absolute. The explanation matters less than the impact. The institutional hysteria was a real force. It disrupted their lives. It threatened their careers. It required a solution. The exorcism, therefore, can be seen as a psychological reset. It was a ritualized way of acknowledging the fear and then dismissing it. By performing the rite, the church provided a container for the anxiety. It said, We see your fear, we name it, and we banish it. Whether or not a demon was actually present is irrelevant to the psychological outcome. The ritual worked because the participants believed it would work. It broke the feedback loop. It gave the men a shared narrative of victory over the darkness. This is the mechanics of belief. In a high-stress environment, belief is a survival tool. It allows people to cope with the uncontrollable. The Tower of London is a place of uncontrollable history. The Exorcism was an attempt to exert control over that history, to say, we are the masters here, not the ghosts. And for a time, it worked. The sightings decreased. The panic subsided. The institutional order was restored. But the underlying causes, the trauma, the isolation, the architecture, remained. And as we will see, the legacy of that night is still felt today. The science explains the how, but it does not explain the why. Why here? Why now? Why these men?
We don't talk about 54.
The Tower of London, a monument to power, pain, and 1,000 years of secrets. But one secret remains buried deeper than most. In the winter of 1954, something happened within these stone walls that forced the church and the crown to confront the unthinkable. It centered on the Salt Tower, a 13th century fortification with a reputation far darker than its name suggests. During the Elizabethan era, it held Catholic priests in the infamous Jesuits' room. Men were suspended from these walls until they were crippled, their screams echoing through the stone. For centuries, it held those accused of sorcery and rebellion, men like Hugh Draper, who carved his soul into the very walls. The Yeoman Warders believed this concentrated suffering left a psychic residue. In 1954, that residue began to push back. George Abbott, a battle-hardened veteran, was the first to report the presence, an overwhelming evil that chilled the very air. He described a suffocating weight on his chest. Dogs refused to enter. The Salt Tower had become a place of terror. The situation reached a breaking point when warders refused to perform their duties alone. The Salt Tower had become a place of tangible, suffocating terror. When warders refused to stand guard alone, the governor had no choice. He called for a ritual of cleansing. Reverend John Pearce-Higgins led the rite. It was a secret battle between modern faith and ancient darkness. They used holy water, incense, and blessed salt to seal the thresholds, a command for the confused dead to finally depart. Blessed salt was used to seal the windows of the prison chamber, adding a new layer of protective folklore to the tower's long, dark history. Reveal the long-term impact. The 1954 ritual changed the culture of the Yeoman Warders. It became a part of their oral history. It became a secret bond between those who served. The tower is no longer just a museum. It is a living entity with a soul that has been tested. The warders speak of the event with a mix of reverence and caution. It is a reminder that some things are beyond their control. Address why the Church of England remains tight-lipped. Even in 2026, 72 years later, the official records are sparse. The Church is uncomfortable with the idea of exorcism in a modern, secular age. It challenges the rationalist worldview. So they keep it quiet. They file it away. But the silence speaks volumes. It suggests truths too difficult to face. The silence was broken in 1957 when a Welsh guardsman reported a nebulous form on the roof, suggesting the cleansing's effects may have been temporary. Conclude by questioning the nature of the ritual. Did it banish a ghost? Or did it offer a desperate psychological reset for men trapped by history? Perhaps both. Perhaps the ghost and the trauma are one and the same. The tower stands as a monument to power and pain. The Salt Tower still holds its secrets, and the Yeoman Warders still walk their beats, watching the shadows, waiting for the next sign. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the heart of the tower. If you found this exploration compelling, please like and share. Subscribe to the Conjuring Files, hit the bell icon to stay updated. Remember, history is not just written, it is felt. The truth is in the files. Don't let the past haunt you. Uncover it.